Hello, my name is Jeff Trinidad, the new Director of Supply Chain Cybersecurity with L3Harris. I'd like to welcome you back to our continuing webinar series that serves as a roadmap to your cybersecurity maturity model certification. So far, we've covered an overview of CMMC, discussed Level 1 compliance, and took a deep dive into Level 3. This webinar will focus on the advanced controls of Level 4 and 5, and what they mean to your cybersecurity posture. Even if your organization is not currently looking to achieve these levels of certification, we encourage you to participate. You can learn more about the intent behind CMMC, future requirements, and hear from our experts in the Q&A session. Remember to access the NeoSMRT portal regularly. It features industry articles, information from the CMMC accreditation body, frequently asked questions, and a compliance gap analysis that you can conduct at your own pace. All vital tools on your road to CMMC compliance. Now I'll turn it over to Ed Bassett, the Chief Information Security Officer with our partner, Neosystems, who's going to take you through the highest levels of CMMC compliance. Thanks for attending, and stay safe.
Thank you, Jeff. This is Ed Bassett. I'm joined here today by Joe Mendigro and David Carlino, both of Neosystems, and we're going to take a nice deep dive into Levels 4 and Level 5, some advanced topics from CMMC. As Jeff said, there's not a lot of companies that are trying to achieve these at this time, but these are requirements that I think should be on the radar of many companies that are working on sensitive DoD projects. With that, I'll turn it over to Joe Mendigro.
Thanks, Ed. For those of you watching, you'll see on the on the page right now, we have our references to the previous webinars that Jeff had mentioned. Those are available. This one will be available about 48 hours after the completion of this. We'll have the slides available as well as a recording of the webinar itself. Our final webinar, in which we discuss how to prepare for and what to expect during the CMMC assessment, was scheduled for August the 18th. At this point, we're going to be postponing that until we actually get the information out. We're waiting on a publication from the advisory or accreditation body so that we have good specific information that I'm sure all of you will be very interested in. So once that information comes out, we'll be posting and advertising the next upcoming webinar.
I also want to mention real quick that if people have questions, they can submit those questions on the attendee question feature within WorkCast, and we'll try to answer some of those. We have some representatives from L3Harris who can answer questions here live on the air today.
Thanks for adding that, Ed. So so for levels 4 and 5, which we'll be discussing today, this is really what we consider to be proactive and advanced and progressive, right? So this is the top end. All the applicable practices are out there and are required. So again, we encourage you, because even though levels 1, 2, and 3 are also part of what is required, if you're a level 4 or a level 5, we couldn't possibly spend the time to go through all of those. So we would, again, encourage you to go back and listen to the discussions we've had on levels 1, 2, and 3 in the previous webinars. Typically, if you will be designated a level 4 or 5, you'll have an elevated level of information, and you're going to be told that one of these levels is applicable to you either by your prime or within the contract. As I mentioned, all previous levels are still applicable, but in addition to the 130 practices for level 3, there are an additional 26 or 41, depending on whether you're level 4 or level 5 of the designated levels. Additionally, there are expectations of a higher degree of program maturity, as we will now discuss. Just a quick review here, so a quick summary. Level 4 is the proactive cyber hygiene. We're looking at a total of 156 practices, as well as demonstrating a process to review and measure activities for effectiveness, review the status with high-level management, and resolve issues. This is, at this level, you're reducing the risk from advanced persistent threats, as well as having a process to review and measure your activities for effectiveness. For level 5, we're talking about a total of 171 practices, which we've laid out here. Again, we're going to get into these details. But in addition to those practices and the previous discussion about maturity, you have to be able to demonstrate that you are optimizing processes for each control in a standard and shareable way. So just at a very high level, but let's jump into it and get into some detail there. From a high level, again, out of all these 17 domains and then the overarching maturity process, what I've done here is highlighted in blue what are, in addition to the level 3 items, what you'll see in dark blue. So we've added some things for IA, MA, PE, PS, and MP, and those domains, which we'll talk about individually, and again, as well as additional maturity requirements. But again, keep in mind that essentially all of these domains are in play now at levels 4 and 5. So when we talk about levels 1, 2, and 3, everything that we've discussed previously is also going to be applicable there. So I think I've kind of beaten that one to death, and everybody should get it at this point that there's a lot to cover, right? So let's talk about process maturity. So within process maturity, at the highest levels, of course, the concepts of establishing a policy for each of the applicable domains, and in this case, all domains are going to be applicable, at levels 4 and 5. So you should really have a comprehensive set of policies and supporting documentation, which generally comes out to be procedures, right? So that's what we've had to do in the past. And then under level 3, we're required to establish, maintain a resource plan that includes all the domains. Essentially what we're talking about there is having an SSP. So now what we're talking about with levels 4 and then levels 5 is having a metrics program, right? Basically a metrics program that that addresses each domain. When you're looking at metrics and to define metrics, what you're looking is for something that follows the, and this is very old school, but the SMART methodology: specific, measurable, actionable, relevant, and time-bound or timely. By having a metrics program that articulates this intent, it becomes easier to look at potential measurements with a clearer lens. So for instance, an access control log will show you the number of people successfully logging in or being denied access. But what does that really mean? I mean, that's just a number that you can capture from a log, but can you do anything with it? Is that is that measurement actionable? Can you change that? Are denials a good thing or a bad thing? It's not really clear. A more actionable metric for the same subject would be to compare the active user log to an employee list and make sure that only active employees or other authorized personnel would have an account that they can log, where they can log in, right? So only authorized users can log in. And your target there, measurable, being a goal of 100%, that would be your target. If there's a gap with that, in that maybe you've realized that your offboarding process isn't as great as it could be, and you've got some accounts that never get disabled, right? And so you have people leaving or being exited from the organization, and they could still potentially log in. That's not good. So certainly something you want to improve. And so if you're not at 100%, that would be your target. So that's, in a sense, what a metrics program would be. you know, you have the ability to identify it, measure it, and then create good standards as far as improving that process and then optimizing it to you know, where your target would be. And that would be an example of that. And you have to have metrics that span across all domains. There are no specific, nothing is spelled out exactly how you should do that. Every organization is going to be a little bit different. So it's going to take some work to figure that out. Ed, you had mentioned before you might have something to add to that at this point. You think I've covered that one, or would you like to add anything?
I think you've covered it. Thanks.
Okay. So that's really the bigger overarching concept, that umbrella of maturity. So now let's get into the actual domains and the individual practices. So again, feeding off the previous topics that were discussed in the Level 1 and Level 5 webinars, we have 4 distinct additional, I'll call them requirements, that are going on within these stated practices that are listed. On the bottom of each of these pages, you'll see all these numbers, right? AC 5.024, spanning all the way down to AC 2.016. And what we're really doing is just referencing every one of the practices that is in play for access control. But again, you know, it's a big list. There's a lot to do. But within levels 4 and 5, what we're really talking about are 4 major issues here. One would be segmentation, that you are required to not only segment your data, but also know how and where your data is flowing. So having an understanding, data flow diagrams would be critical. And this is specifically when we're talking about CUI and non-CUI data. So if any of you are familiar with the concept of PCI and the segmentation that goes on in a PCI environment, that would be the same concept here. And of course, segmentation can help you to minimize the scope of your environment when it comes to this. Access control reviews are very important. It's up to you to choose a frequency for how often you're going to do the reviews, but whatever you do choose, as it's documented, you need to make sure that you actually do it and can show evidence of it. So my example before, when I talked about the metrics, really feeds to this, where we're saying, okay, we're going to do a review of our Active Directory environment versus our employee list, and we're going to document that we did that on, say, a quarterly basis. That would be what they're talking about here. For policy denial, this is really when we say policy, we're not talking about a written policy, but actually, you know, a denial of rights based on devices that a system can control. And then wireless access control, the ability to detect and respond to unauthorized wireless access points. So, you know, technologies in place that would be able to control that. We'll move on to asset management.
Yeah, and I'll step in for asset management here. This is David Carlino. Asset management is definitely a difficult topic for all of the CMMC controls. At level 1, 2, there are no controls. At level 3, there is a specific control about understanding data flow. And then at level 4, you get this control about discovering and identifying systems, which in the end seems a bit misleading. So I think it's important with this asset management family to step back a little bit and understand how the domains work. So asset management, if you recall from our level 3 presentation, is a domain, one of the 17 domains that make up the full CMMC list. Each domain has specific capabilities that are inherent to the entire control set within that domain. So where you'll see AM3 and AM4, those are practices. The practices are there to clarify exactly how to meet the capabilities specified for the domain. So that's kind of a weird wrap up, but when you go to the control set and you read about these asset management really starts with identifying, inventorying, and managing your technology assets. That's what you're aiming at here. When you get to level 4, you need to have specific attributes documented. Firmware and OS type are the examples. It specifies when you go through the appendix that you need to, as you grow from a small organization, you may be able, at a small organization size with very few changes, accomplish this manually. But the expectation is that as you grow, you're going to need a tool that helps you to discover and identify these things. So I think the main challenge with asset management at this point is understanding, do you have a tool that can do this? Is it trustworthy? And is it going to get you to the end result that you need, which is really understanding your system boundary and making sure that your security program and your compliance efforts have 100% coverage. And you can move on there, Joe.
Zed, I'll jump in for audit and accountability. So as we saw in some of the other ones, this is kind of a refinement of existing requirements that happen at the lower levels, right? So adding some nuance. And with audit and accountability, it's no different. So we had a requirement at level 3 to collect logs into centralized repositories. So the idea of collecting the logs and reviewing them was there. What's added here is the idea for some automated analysis. So that requires some threat feeds, really taking a look at the tactics, techniques, and procedures, the so-called TTPs of the threat. What are the things that the bad guys are doing right now? And feeding that in to do some machine learning or some automated analysis of the logs to see if any of that stuff is happening to us. There's a shift from sort of a predefined response to some automated responses, right? The idea being, instead of just thinking about it ahead of time and understanding what you might do, putting that into some automation so that you can take responsive actions quickly for certain kinds of things. There's also a requirement for correlation across multiple machines and log sources. So the idea that if something is happening, maybe in one place in your network, it might not concern you, but if you saw that same thing happening in a lot of different places, a trend, a lot of widespread activity of a certain type, that might be more suspicious. So the ability to detect that and notice it in time to take some action is important. So that means not a strict requirement, but tends to be people shifting towards normalizing their data format. So if you have different kinds of systems producing different kinds of logs, putting those into a system that normalizes them so that you can look with one view across many different types of machines, many different types of activity is very helpful. There's also a requirement to proactively notice if you have any missing logs. So one of the challenges with log management is that if a log goes quiet, that could be because nobody's using the system, it's turned off, or it's not in use at this time, or it could be because the log mechanism has failed. So noticing the difference between something that's quiet and something that's dead is kind of a subtlety, often requiring putting in like a heartbeat or something so that you can see that something is still alive, even though there's no user activity going on that system at this time, and being able to distinguish that from failures, identify those failures, and get them fixed in reasonable time. Next slide.
Okay, and then I'll talk about awareness and training requirements. So what we're really saying here is not only are you going to do training, but you're going to customize that training and to your organization. You're going to consider advanced APTs, advanced persistent threats. You're going to look at things like training through websites, emails, advertising, pop-ups, articles, and social engineering, things like that. Training can include techniques for recognizing suspicious emails, so phishing is an example. The use of removable systems in non-secure settings, and the potential targets of individuals by adversaries outside the workplace. So it's really creating a thoughtful training program that's specific to your needs. Also making sure that that training is updated at least annually as called out. So that's going to be an important point that can sometimes catch organizations, right? If you're requiring training of your entire base that you need to be able to demonstrate. You better start that early, right? Because you need to be able to demonstrate that the training has been completed by everyone in the organization within that 12-month period, as annually would define. So you have to plan ahead, because it generally takes chasing some folks down. Takes a while to be able to get that done. And then additionally, having some practical exercises involved in this. So, for instance, no-notice social engineering attempts to gain unauthorized access, or using a phishing email where you can send it out there and test to see if what the responses are like. And again, thinking back to those metrics, you can have some great metrics out of that to say, we did training, or we did a phishing attempt in May, and 75% of people clicked on that link. And then we had some additional training, and only 40% of the people clicked on that link. Good news, right? Showing progress, that kind of attitude there. And configuration management.
Configuration management. So configuration management is always hard. Hard for all organizations to figure out the right balance between what things need to be change controlled and how to build a usable system, how to educate the administrators on what they need to put in a ticket for, how to do security impact analysis. That balance is usually up to you. With level 4 CMMC, it's getting a pretty high bar, and it's going to be difficult to make this whole thing usable if you don't buy a tool and you don't have a process. So application whitelisting, this is really the process of application control. No longer saying you're not allowed to use an application. You've already gone through your entire list and decided only these applications will be used within my system boundary. So if you remember the system boundary discussion from the beginning of the conversation, this is where you've defined where CUI is allowed to flow. You've written all those systems down in an inventory, and now you're going to pick the software that's allowed to run on those systems. That's difficult to do in the first place. That's really difficult to keep up with. In order to keep up with it, you will have a corresponding process that complements the technology you've purchased and implemented to do application control. And that process is going to allow users to reach out to say, I need a new application, or the app to be vetted. Which system is it going to go on? What's the impact of doing so? Once approved, it makes the whitelist, and now it can actually technically run within the system. The next bullet here is really a level 5 control, and it's going to specify the kind of vetting that you need to do prior to approving an application, not only at the start, but every time it runs. So the step here is to verify the software, anything you've identified as security critical or essential software, to verify that when it starts up and runs, it's doing so in an appropriate manner, that an attacker has not somehow modified the OS or the boot processes, kind of the kernel objects that are making up the detailed underlying, this is how the OS is going to start, this is how the app is going to start. At the level 5 of attacking with advanced persistent threat, attackers are trying to get in and underneath all of the rest of your tools and technologies. So that level 5 bar is really high, and again, you're going to need a tool to do it. Most of these advanced application control tools will allow you to, but the whole system you need to put in place for configuration management at level 4 and 5 is a significantly higher bar.
For incident response, the objective here is to improve the speed, accuracy, capability of the incident response process. So at level 3, we saw the idea of having a plan for incident response. But at level 4 and 5, the idea is to make that response truly responsive to the details of what's going on and make it happen faster, and again with more accuracy and more capability. So there's requirement for 24/7 situational awareness, having tools and skills that are needed to enable response and investigation. There's requirement to use knowledge of the attacker techniques, so the tactics, techniques, and procedures, the TTPs I mentioned before. What the threat actually does in real life needs to inform the response. So there's a requirement to share that information, get threat intelligence from others. The requirement does make it clear that organizations are not expected to do their own intelligence collection work, but they are expected to take advantage of that which is available to them. So it could be classified or unclassified depending on your situation. There's a requirement to do some forensic data gathering. So the idea here is to be able to counter the threat actions that they may be taking to cover their tracks and to maintain persistent access. So the idea that they're going to be taking active actions to avoid detection, and you're going to be taking actions on the forensic side to look at evidence that might have been destroyed or might have been modified, but still make some sense of what's going on and be able to detect at the when the attacker is taking action within your system. There's a requirement for some real-time response. So this can be automated or manual, but the idea is to have predefined steps to react to expected attack patterns. Most of the attacks that we see are not novel. They're repeated. That's we mentioned the TTPs. These things have been studied. They're fairly well known. And so yes, it's possible that an attacker could try something completely brand new, but for the most part, they have standard books of procedures that they follow, and the idea being that you want to be able to understand how you would respond to those expected attack patterns. There's a requirement for a response team that can operate within 24 hours. So these are rare occurrences, these kind of incidents. They require specialized tools and skills. So the idea is you have to have that team already assembled on demand and able to take action. So again, setting the bar at 24 hours to be able to either physically or virtually be on the job and ready to isolate, collect evidence, reduce the spread of an attack by containing it, etc. The last item is requirement for some exercises. So again, because these are rare occurrences, we need to really train and test the team and make sure that they're well prepared and able to handle that. These exercises need to be unannounced, and the idea is that you want to really understand how that team and those capabilities that you've assembled, want to understand how they behave and make some improvements there if you find some weaknesses.
For recovery, it looks pretty straightforward. We've got one bullet, but it's actually quite a bit of work. What they're saying here is basically they're requiring an organization to do, and this is literally what it says, to do what is needed in order for their solution to continue to function under stress or attack. So they're being openly vague about what you need to do, but it's like they're expecting you to get it done. Bearing in mind the maturity levels at 4 and 5 and the concept that plans are required for each domain, this will be interesting to see once the actual auditor requirements come out, but we're interpreting this as if you were to, nothing explicitly says you need to develop a business impact analysis or build a business continuity plan. Certainly a disaster recovery plan would be required, but I would expect one good way to do this would be to build out a comprehensive BIA and BCP within your organization, right? Understanding what the critical processes are, and then defining your recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives accordingly based on those BIAs, and then building out that BCP to lay out that good mature plan.
On growing on that, there is no strict requirement for the type of assessments you're going to do, but the risk management family of controls, this domain, is getting at some concept of annually you need to go through and analyze the effectiveness of all the things you've put in place. So your disaster recovery business continuity plan would be among them. So again, while it's not called out and it's seemingly purposely vague, the risk management family is going to involve actually looking at what you've done and trying to figure out, is this working? So going through these, the TTPs here are continuing to be required, tools, techniques, and procedures. You need to understand your adversary. You need to be in the offense informs defense category of risk management. So what you're trying to do is understand who's out there, what are they doing, how can I figure out what they're doing rapidly using threat intelligence systems, how can I build my solution to allow that data to get to the people doing threat hunting. So a couple valuable tools in doing this, the MITRE tools are very helpful. You can look up the groups by ATP number, the exact attacks and techniques they use. You can use the attack eval tools. It's a powerful tool. It's a little overwhelming and confusing, but I highly recommend you take a look at it. What it's getting at here is use the threat orientation. If you're familiar with the NIST RMF or the NIST risk management style, the threat orientation, start with the threat itself and ask yourself, how well would I deal with this? What tools do I have to stop this from happening? That is an ongoing and forever activity, along with port scanning, which is going to require you to use something like Nmap, Nessus, Qualys, and you're actually going to look at the ports that are open on your boundary on a regular basis to inform how you may or may not get attacked. And you need to have a process for non-whitelisted software. So things that you need to use that maybe aren't able to be in your whitelisted toolset, applications or appliances come to mind here. It's running on its own little piece of hardware, so it won't necessarily be whitelisted, and you need to have an exception process for that. So the main takeaway here, build a risk management process, probably use MITRE. When it comes to threat intel, you should look at the MISP tool, Malware Information Sharing Platform. It's an open source threat intel for your SIM platform. And do subscribe to the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. They will send you indicators and precursors to look for in your environment and help with your threat profiling. You can move on there, Jeff.
Under security assessment, CA, 3 requirements, so roadmap, pen test, and red team. I'll go through each of those. So the roadmap is really a roadmap for improvement of your security program. So the idea being to proactively plan, improve, and adapt the security program over time. You want to take a look at things that are changing in terms of the risks you're facing, the way the threat might be evolving their techniques, as well as some advances in IT, the way you may be doing IT for your business, as well as new security technologies that may come to bear. I want to emphasize that this security roadmap is not a plan of action, a milestone. It's not a way to keep track of your to-do list if you don't meet the requirements. At this level, the expectation is that you do meet the requirements, and you're looking to then improve and enhance what you're doing above and beyond that. So again, not a substitute for the POAM. The roadmap expectation is that it looks both short, medium, and long term. So 6 to 12 months on the short term, 1 to 3 years on the medium term, and 5 to 10 years on the long. So really looking out pretty far, where you may be looking at an entirely different threat environment, entirely different defenses that might be available to you in the marketplace in that 5 to 10 year window. So again, taking a pretty broad look at that and planning that in advance in terms of what your intent is, selecting vendors, budgeting, all those kind of things that would play in there. The next 2, pen test and red team exercises, I want to differentiate between those a little bit. So the penetration testing is designed to use attacker techniques to be able to find weaknesses that might be exploited and determine if those weaknesses could or could not be exploited by a real-world attacker. The red team intent is to exercise the defenders, to evaluate their effectiveness, train them, give them some experience with real-world techniques. So common factor is that they both focus on using actual techniques that the threat might use, but they're typically done as separate exercises. So the pen test could be automated or manual. Intent is to use a combination of both automated and manual techniques. They should be actual threat methods. They should be informed by the kind of attacks that are being used today. The idea being to look and see, are the vulnerabilities that you may have discovered with like an automated vulnerability scan, are those things really exploitable given the way you have your system configured and how those vulnerabilities might be exposed to an attacker. The other key thing to determine from a pen test is what ability do we have to detect the threat activity? How does it show up, and can we actually see it? CMMC does call for the pen testing to be done in a white box fashion. So that is, there are different schools of thought on penetration testing. In white box, the attackers have full knowledge of the system ahead of time. There's also a black box where they're told nothing about the system and have to mount an attack, and then gray box somewhere in the middle. So CMMC specifically says white box testing is preferred, in fact required. And the idea being, the philosophy is that adversaries are going to collect knowledge before they attack in the real world. We're not trying to defend against attacks of convenience. we're trying to defend against state-sponsored adversaries that are going to mount a concerted attack against members of the defense industrial base. So they're going to spend time and money collecting knowledge. So rather than paying a pen tester over a long period of time, a lot of money to collect that same information, we just give it to them. The idea is that if they had that information, how would they attack and how successful would that attack be? And the last item on this is red team exercises. So the idea here is to validate the effectiveness of the defenses. Can I detect, disrupt, and thwart attacks? So again, these are typically done in a transparent way between the attacker and defender, with the attacker simulating what a real attacker would do, but in communication with the defenders. So the idea is that the defenders gain experience and improve their performance. You may do these from the outside in typically, but it's also recommended that we do some inside, where the red team is basically allowed to have already penetrated the network and mounts an attack from an inside vantage point.
For situational awareness, I think you'll start to see a compounding of practices on each other. I think this is the third time now that, at least a third time within this, that we've discussed threat hunting capabilities, right? So in this case, we're establishing and maintaining threat hunting capabilities to search for indicators of compromise in organization systems and detect, track, and disrupt threats that evade existing controls. You're likely at this level to be getting intel from government sources. You're being fed that real-time, live, and very specific data. The expectation is that you're going to do something with that data once you've gotten it. So you're proactively looking at those indicators to see if you were impacted once you do receive that information. Additionally, within your design, your network design and system security capabilities, you're considering these types of factors within the design, right? So it's not just laying out a network design, but actually, considering this information. So, for instance, they're making modifications or additional DMZs or putting in some sort of protection that will help against some of those advanced persistent attacks.
All right, system and communication protection. This is a long family all the time for the level 3 protections as well, long domain. So there's a lot in here. Rather than going through all the controls, I'll just kind of call your attention to the main ideas. Network segmentation is sort of where we're starting. Physical and logical isolation techniques. So this can be done obviously through an air-gapped network physically. It can be done through virtualization. So Microsoft has a lot of really good writing on how to build a tiered, isolated, administrative platform, so that you can have a proper DMZ, a proper middle layer, a proper admin layer, how they can communicate with one another. I would highly suggest looking into that writing, whether you're using Microsoft products or not. I think it does a good job at explaining a lot of that. Threat intelligence with DNS and the next several that you can see down there, those relate really to next generation firewall capabilities. In the original or in the level 3 writing, you'll see a lot of stuff about IDS, IPS, which is a basic tool to look at network traffic, identify what it is, and drop it if it doesn't look appropriate. That's the preventative part of IPS. So at this level, you're looking much more at blocking DNS, blocking executable code in a sandbox, URL filtering and categorization, and getting into PCAP or packet capture. And the final one there, port and protocol compliance. Those are all really next generation firewall capabilities. So next generation firewalls can be expensive, are expensive. All these capabilities cost more, and all these capabilities require someone to manage them on an ongoing basis. So you're probably not looking at a simple set of additional controls here, especially when you start to look at 24/7 SOC, threat hunting. This is looking like now you're going to need a pretty expensive piece of gear, some pretty expensive processes around that piece of gear to make sure that it's functioning properly, and getting it all into a 24/7 position. So quite a big uplift from the level 3 standard.
All right, for this next item, system and information integrity, again, the common theme here, defending against advanced persistent threats, the APTs, is what we're trying to do is bring the level of intrusion detection and sort of monitoring of the system up to where it can detect fairly sophisticated attacks. So one requirement here is to feed the signatures or indicators of that threat activity to intrusion detection systems. So the idea is to make sure that those systems are tuned with the latest and greatest ways that threat activity might expose itself, so that we have a better chance of detecting it. Also feeding that information to those who are doing threat hunting and making sure that they have, again, that latest knowledge of the threat activity and how to identify it. There's a requirement for some behavioral analysis. So noticing the attackers using the systems in an abnormal way. One of the things that's common in most attack scenarios these days is a phase of the attack called living off the land. So often when attackers find a way into a system, they don't get to where they want to be. They don't have enough privilege to actually take the system down or accomplish their mission. So they have maybe found a way in that has limited privileges. They want to use what they have available and move around and look for opportunities to elevate their privilege, again, to get to their ultimate mission. As they're doing that, they're exploring, they're looking, they're trying things, they're testing the system to see if they can find a way to elevate their privilege. That activity, if you can detect it, you can stop the attack before it has a lot of adverse effect. So being able to do enough analysis of how the systems are being used to identify that anomalous behavior is the intent here. The expectation is that you're able to monitor system usage and notice those anomalies. So any new behavior that's out of the realm of the way people typically use the system is suspect, not necessarily bad, but at least worth investigating. Ideally, this should be automated. There's enough activity going on that it's really not practical to do this any other way. But automating the analysis with some kind of machine learning or other analytics that are happening in real time, so that you can look at maybe more things than a human analysis team would possibly be able to check into.
So not too bad, huh? Just a few extra requirements that you have to do for levels 4 and 5. These areas here are ones that don't have any additional practices, but I do want to point out that in these areas that maturity requirements, so defining metrics, are still going to apply, right? So even though you don't have additional practices to pursue, you will have to measure and track improvements in these areas as well. Before we jump into the Q&A session, I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes walking through the NeoSMRT website and pointing out a few things that folks, from the feedback we've gotten, maybe have had a little bit of confusion. So I just wanted to take a few minutes here, but we'll definitely make sure we reserve some time for answering some of your questions. So if you've been in the website and you haven't registered yet, or you've had some issues with the registration, you might find this a little confusing because maybe you received an email thanking you for registering, and you say, well, I've already registered. Well, in fact, that's just an unfortunate use of terminology, because you might have gotten a thank you for registering for a webinar, right? And actually you haven't yet registered for an account. There was also a time earlier where people using the L3Harris code were able to log in generically and just gain access to the environment. But now we've upped our security game here so that, because we have the ability to do self-assessments within the environment, we basically want you as a one-time shot. Each individual user will register for an account. In doing so, you'll create a password and you'll choose a multi-factor authentication process to do that. So once you've done that, then you will only be given the choice to log into your account. Once you log in, you will normally see this message right here. The only time that you might see that previous screen again is if you clear your cache or use a different browser. Once you're in, wanted to point out the we do have a welcome page which gives you very specific news and information on that very first page. That's quite obvious, but I wanted to direct your attention to the NeoSMRT supplier portal. Well, actually here we've got our page. This is updated information. So you can see right here, we'll update this, remove that level 4 and 5 and say you could find that information here, but what's coming up next? Just watch that, log in on occasion and you'll see the latest news. If we get that audit information from the advisory body, that would be something that we would want to put here and make it obvious for you. Few other things, the user profile, fill out what you're comfortable with filling out here under the user profile. This is specific to you as a user. This is also the location where you can put in, where you can change your password if you need to. For the supplier portal, if you have more than one individual logging in and from your organization, this is a shared profile. So you'll see things like DUNS numbers and cage codes. Basically, if you don't know what those are, you don't have to worry about it, right? Maybe somebody in your organization does have that information. What we're trying to do is make sure that we've identified who the organization is, according to the name here. So, be aware that if this should be general information for the organization, maybe not your specific contact phone number, but, the information for the organization itself, which is unique to, compared to the user profile. One of the key pages that everybody loves is the supplier resource page. This is where we have all the information regarding the previous education webinars, whether it's our specific L3Harris webinars that we've been doing, or some of the Neosystem town halls or some other information. You'll find that as on-demand educational webinars, as well as the upcoming training courses you'll find here as well. And then we have some additional information, such as information from the CMMC, and we've been updating our FAQs, so questions that are asked of us periodically through the webinars will update the most relevant information, so you can get some of your answers from there as well. On the readiness status side, I'm not showing every one of these steps, but I just wanted to make a few definitions because this has been maybe a little confusing for some people as well. But when you're asked through the readiness 6 quick steps, what is your current level? And that would be right now, since since certification is not yet possible, only not currently certified should be selected at this point. This is different than your target CMMC level, right? Because you may decide that I am going for a level 1 or I'm going for a level 3, and that's something that you can always change later, but you may know today what that level is and what you want to achieve. So current certification status is that current level, which is step 1, versus your desired target CMMC level, which is step 2. So I want to make that definition there. We've got some notes in there to help guide that, so look at those notes on each page. The status of your gap analysis, this gives you 3 options. One is to complete the quick gap analysis. We'll look at that in a moment. The second is to go to the more comprehensive self-assessment, and the third is to skip this step for the moment. If you completed the gap analysis, please change the status to completed and specify the date. If you aren't ready to do either of those steps, skip to the next page because you can always go back and readdress this later. Step 4, which is where you enter all the security solutions and or service providers you have engaged or plan to engage for CMM compliance. You may enter TBD at this point if you don't know, and update when that information is known. Again, this is a living process, so you can always go back and make updates and additions as appropriate. For step 5, it's the selected certified third-party assessor organization. At this point, you know, very dynamic situation, but you probably don't have any, you know, you certainly haven't identified your who your assessor is going to be at this point, because we don't have a list of assessors out there. Although that's changing very quickly as people are now allowed to sign up for that process. So go back and update that as applicable. And then step 6 is indicate the date your assessment was completed or is planned to be completed. The issuance of the certification may occur at a later date and is not necessarily the same, certainly isn't the same as the date that the assessment occurred. So provide a proposed date if known, otherwise go back and update it as appropriate. And let me just show you a couple of those slides so you know what we're talking about here. So what is your readiness status? We have on the left side there, complete your gap analysis, which is that option, which is step 3 for completing that, versus if you're not sure what your gaps are, you can take the self-assessment quiz, which is a specific line-by-line question for each one of the practices. So anywhere up to 176 if you're going through all the levels. And then here's just a screenshot of what those service providers and technical solutions that you might be recording there. You can see that you can add a section. So if you've got a multitude of providers and technical solutions, you can add them accordingly. This is what the gap analysis looks like. So if you've previously done a self-assessment through another tool or through a manual process and you feel confident about where your gaps are, you can come in here and quickly just tag these things and say, here's where my gaps are today. And over time, of course, uncheck those boxes as you close out those gaps. But looking at this, each one of these line items rolls up into many of the things we've discussed over the past webinar. So this isn't really advised to be a tool that you just click on things because you think there's a gap there. This could really be a good tool to quickly go through, like I said, if you've already done a self-assessment previously. And then here's a screenshot of what the self-assessment, one of the questions, looks like on the left-hand side. You can either say that you've addressed it or you plan to address it and put a date, and you can put in comments for yourself to be able to track those notes. So later on, you can go back and say, okay, we've addressed where we feel that gap was, and now we can say that this is completed. On the right-hand side, you'll see in the dashboard, you'll have a roll-up of what the status is of each of the levels that you're addressing, whether, and where you are for completing the quiz at each one of the levels. So why don't we go ahead and jump to the Q&A section, because we don't have too much time left. Ed, do you want to set us up with some questions, or is somebody going to?
There's just a few questions from the audience here, and mainly around the URL to the site or the link to get to the portal that you were just showing. So I did answer those, and it should show up in the Q&A, in the attendee question. There should be a public answer there, but I'll read it off. It's NeoSMRT.neosystems.cloud. So that's Neo, NeoSMRT .neosystems, NeoSYSTEMS.cloud/L3Harris.
And if you're not writing
the attendee question, so you don't have to, you can copy and paste it out of the attendee question panel if you can see it there.
From there, and as well as these slides will be available, and we've put it in the one of the ending slides here at the bottom, so you'll find it there as well. Was that the primary question, Ed?
Yeah, I don't have any questions about the level 4 and level 5 requirements. So good there.
One of the, yeah, and my apologies if I sped through the, through the portal. If there, I was hoping, I thought we might have more questions, so I didn't want to spend too much time looking at screenshots. But hopefully through this recording or through that, what I just talked about, that may help you. Certainly, if you haven't yet been invited to the portal, when you go to register, you may get a message indicating that you need to be invited, and there'll be clear instructions on sending a simple email that will get you through that process, and within about 24 hours or so, we'll get you access to the environment if you don't have it today. Gentlemen from L3Harris, does any Jeff or Joe or sorry, I'm not sure who else is on there. Does anybody have anything they would like to add? I might have put him on the spot there if looking for that unmute button.
We have a question coming in that says you appear to need to be invited. So how do you get invited? He says, my company forwarded me an email with a code, but it doesn't seem to work. So if people did not get an invite, but they are part of the L3Harris supply chain, who should they contact? What email address should they use to try to get connected here?
That is a great question. So that code was from the older environment, and yes, that certainly wouldn't work now. Like I mentioned, we do have to have a unique invite for each individual in an organization. I'm looking that up right now. Like I said, if you attempted to log in, you'll see that you'll see that message, but I'm trying to remember because I closed my email here. It's Jeff, if you know it off the top of your head while I'm struggling to get this open.
This is Joe from L3Harris. If you email cybersecurity _SC Sam Charlie for supply chain at L3Harris.com, we can send you the registration link that you're looking for.
Thanks for that, Joe. I should have that email address memorized by now, but I didn't. Sorry.
And one other item just came in from the audience. And this is a little bit of feedback and also a question. It says, we have many prime contractors. L3Harris has been the most helpful of all the primes I've reviewed. So thanks for that feedback. Appreciate it. Do we need to do something similar to flow down to our suppliers as you are doing here? So the requirement, or there's no strict requirement for management and mentoring and guidance of the supply chain, but obviously if your supply chain isn't up to speed with CMMC, then it puts you in a bad position of being able to accept award of contracts. So certainly encourage as much flow down as people can do to get the word out to their suppliers and make sure that they're ready to go with the CMMC requirements. And that's something we're trying to do at Neosystems with the NeoSMRT portal is provide it to as many suppliers as we can to help them get access to the information they need to understand their readiness, and if they're lagging behind, to accelerate that and make sure they're ready on time to make their customers happy.
And that's something that we kind of glossed over a little bit during one of the slides, but under levels 4 and 5, and certainly not a bad practice for any organization, but the concept of supplier risk management, right, and having a program where you identify who all of your suppliers are, and managing the risks of those suppliers. CMMC doesn't specifically call out how you should do that, but we certainly can provide you, what L3Harris is doing here today is a great example of that. And, we could certainly provide some guidance if anybody's looking for, has questions on ideas about how to go about meeting that requirement. Well, I think we're at the hour. So I think we are good. Thank you very much
Thank you
for
very much,
your
Jeff.
time, everyone. We really appreciate it.